Hi, this is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. A great many knitted garments begin with a hung hem. It's called a hung hem because we cast on using either E-wrap or chain stitch, knit a few rows, and then hang the cast on, closing the hem. This creates a doubled fabric edge that doesn't pull in, and we like it usually not to flare out. To prevent it from flaring out, very frequently we'll turn down the stitch dial 1 or even 2 numbers lower than the main stitch size. So let's look at a couple ways to make the hung hem. Let's make the most common version of hung hem. This would be exactly the same whatever kind of machine you were using in terms of gauge. It's a little bit different on a Passap, which I'll discuss in a moment. Most of the time we begin by E-wrapping towards the carriage, then threading the yarn into the carriage, knitting a few rows. Okay, I've knitted 12 rows. In this yarn, 6 rows equals an inch, so we'll make about a 1-inch hem when we do this. Now we just lift the E-wraps and hang them on the needles. You can hang every one like this, or some people like the look better hanging every other one. The reason in favor of every other one is it's less work plus less bulk to show through on the knitting. Now here's a trick when you're knitting the first row. It's easier to start with the needles all the way forward and to turn up the stitch dial to as far as it will go and knit this one row. That hides the bulk. The bulk created by having 2 stitches on every needle. And you can see the different look where I was hanging every E-wrap. It's a smoother look than when it was every other, but in a few rows you'll be able to examine it. Doesn't look much different, but you can see a slight difference. Just suppose we're knitting a scarf and you want both ends of the scarf to have the same kind of hem. I finally figured out how to do this, and it's so simple it should have been obvious. Maybe everybody else but me already knew. When you get to the end of the scarf, minus 1 inch for the hem, use a separate piece of the yarn to E-wrap again and knit 12 rows again. Okay, there are my 12 rows. My E-wraps are clearly visible. All I have to do is lift them onto the needles and bind off. Now there is another way that involves making a slip row and hanging the slip bars. It just doesn't work great for me. Some people succeed beautifully at it, so I won't criticize it, but it's not my favorite, and I like the look and the ease of doing it this way. Now you could either bind off from here or do what I'm going to do. I prefer to knit a row so that I have an easier way to bind off. And now, since I'm on the left side, I'll bind off using the transfer method. Were I on the right side, being right-handed, I'd have no trouble binding off around the gate pegs. I have not learned to do that with my left hand, so the transfer method works just fine. And now here you go. This is my second end. There's the hung hem. This is my first end with the hung hem. In this yarn, I think that I prefer the every needle E-wrap, and you should always check your swatch. It'll vary with the yarn. I think this and this, which were every needle hung, look better than this. But that's a personal taste, and it depends on what you're doing. Here's another way to accomplish a hung hem with a slight difference. You can begin by chaining around the needle shanks and go through the same process, knitting, in this case, 12 rows, but however many you want, and hang the chains. Okay, there is my 12 rows. And the thing that I want to make you aware of is that you would have the choice here of hanging a whole chain stitch like this or one loop of yarn. And in almost every case, I would vote for the single loop of yarn. With a stiff, thick yarn such as this one, especially so, because having 2 extra loops of yarn on there, as if I did this, is going to create a really stiff first row and a stiff spot in your knitting. And let me knit a few rows here and you can see how this looks. It's really no different than the other way of doing it to look at. However, a chain stitch is a little less stretchy and more stable than an E-wrap, and you might like the look of it from the back. They look a little different from the back. Sometimes you can see the back. Now, where I hung every E-wrap, the look is not much, but you can see how the chain tended to pull in. And it depends what you're doing, whether that's a good thing or not. Okay, what if we are knitting on a Passap? You have a couple of choices. First of all, you could put your E-wraps right into the hooks of the machine, because the needles have got to stay in normal working position. That's the only way a Passap knits. It does not knit from the all the way forward position. And now the yarn would actually already be through the feeding eyelet before you E-wrap. You would pull out a tail and do that. I don't find that it is 100% successful to do this. So what I do when I'm E-wrapping on the Passap is pull the needles forward, and I'm going to E-wrap from the opposite direction. And I'm sure you already know that you've got to make your E's backwards if you're going from the opposite direction. Now, this is still my working yarn pulled through the eyelets, and now I'm going to manually knit 1 row. So as to make certain the needles will be able to knit from henceforth. Now we have normal stitches in the hooks, and there's no further problem for the Passap machine. And if you have any doubts about the success of that first row, this is the way to go, and now you can knit a normal hem and hang it. But let's show hanging it. Remember, squint your eyes, and this is a Passap machine. And again, usually when there are 2 loops of yarn on a needle, it's easier to knit back from forward position if using a Japanese machine. But since a Passap won't do that, you can either put the loops of yarn right in the hooks, and if the machine will knit the first row from normal working position, you can do that. If it won't, then you could manually knit this row and then move the locks to the other side. And if I were using a yarn as proportionately stiff as this one, that's exactly what I would do. However, while I knit this pretend Passap hem, I will say that I don't see a great reason to use the hung hem on the Passap most of the time, because the circular hem looks almost identical on the garment and is really easy to do on the Passap. However, if you find that you have an occasion when you need to, the Passap can make a hung hem.